I'd love to jump right into today's session, introduce the topic, introduce our guest for today, and maybe I'll start there. Our guest is also from Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, and it's Lacey Picazo. Lacey is the founder and CEO of Zoco Design. And first of all, Lacey, it's awesome to have you here with us.
Ditto. Thanks for hosting me, Mike.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, the topic that we're getting into, I think it's an important one. It's quieting product mind, mastering your inner monologue for better product decision making. And to me, it's interesting because I hear that inner dialogue all the time, constantly, but I feel like it's not something I necessarily talk about with people. And I feel like that's kind of common. Like not everybody talks about that inner monologue that's sort of going on, that sometimes back and forth we have with ourselves. And yeah, I don't know, as product people, I feel like that can have a big impact on the products that we're building. So first of all, thank you for coming to talk about this topic.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. I have lots of thoughts on both how this has plagued me, how we've seen it interfere with client decision making. It has a huge impact on our decisions and relationships for sure.
Well, maybe, let's start with what we're even talking about in the first place. When we say
Mhm.
that inner monologue or inner dialogue, inner
Yeah.
voice, especially for product people, what do we really mean? And why as product people should we be mindful of this?
Yeah, totally. To start, like when I say inner voice, inner monologue, I'm talking about our ego. I'm not talking about us as a human, like what Lacey thinks and believes, but this little voice in your head that narrates and reflects on everything you do. It's the voice that pops in if you're feeling embarrassed, if you're feeling fear, if you're uncertain about something. It's the voice that makes meaning of behaviors of people around us, right? Like maybe you've interpreted something today that somebody else has done, and your interpretation may or may not be accurate, but based on that belief that you create, like, oh gosh, they didn't hold the door for me, or oh gosh, they did this, that then becomes your reality. And you will perform and change your behavior based on what your ego tells you and how you believe. So, to give you an example, like let's imagine, like set product land aside for a second. Let's imagine that you're a parent, you're at the park with a friend, and your kiddo is swinging on the swing. You got a little toddler with you, and they're swinging higher and higher and higher. And then eventually they fall off, right? Like it's happened to all of us who have kiddos. But then let's imagine that your friend tells you, oh, Lacey, you should have been there. Lacey, why'd you let her go so high? Lacey, that's really dangerous. I think everybody's looking at you right now. What are you going to do? Are you going to console her? Lacey, you're really not a very good parent. Listen, if you had a friend that said those things, they wouldn't be your friend,
Mhm.
but you say those things to yourself all the time, right? Like your inner monologue is not always very nice, and its interpretations are not always accurate, like in what you're afraid of, what you're nervous about. But it's constantly dissecting what's happening around you, looking for risk, trying to analyze patterns. And this is actually why I think it's extra prevalent, Mike, in product land, thinking about all of us product people on the call today. Across my team, and I lead a product design and UX research studio, and we embed in product teams. So we get to see lots of different leaders, lots of different teams, and how they work every single year. And I think the one quality that really ties both UXers and product managers together is that we are amazing systems thinkers, very curious, great context builders. We're going to match qualitative patterns other people don't see. We're very likely to look out into the future and analyze risks and kind of play mental chess to see, like, well, if I do this, what could happen and how, might that affect other things in the system? And it's a superpower. It's a gift to be a curious systems thinking pattern matcher. And it's a deficit because when we do that, we're much more likely to assume patterns that aren't accurate. We're much more likely to assume, oh, this happened. And so therefore it must mean this, or this must be why that person on my team made this decision. They must be thinking about this, or this must be why the customer's behaving in this way. If only we tweak and change this thing or launch this new feature. And I think the hard part is like, because not only do we mostly have this quality across product teams, it tends to be a very useful quality, and it tends to actually be right more often than many of our peers. But that means we can over rely on this superpower, and we can assume that it's accurate when it's not actually accurate. So if I think about the people who I've seen most plagued by anxieties about the future and anxieties about like, hey, this happened, so it must mean something else. It happens a lot in UX. It happens a lot in product. And I think that's what's driving behind it. Like if you take a personality test, Personalysis is one that our team uses a lot. Blue is the color that's exactly what I'm talking about, like super strength, I'm curious, and pattern matching. It is in spades across my whole team. And it is the quality that I think is so beneficial, but also makes us all more susceptible to disruptive thought patterns.
Yeah, that you are everything you're saying. My inner monologue is saying she is exactly right. Because honestly, the whole inner monologue thing, it's what it's part of the origin story for Product Collective. So I guess in this case, it turned
Yeah.
into a positive. But I remember when I had my first product role, I first of all almost talked them out of it, right? Like when they were recruiting me for this role, I remember saying, this sounds great, but I never went to school for product management. Like, I don't know if I'd be good for it. And they're like, oh no, Mike, nobody went to school for product management. You'll be fine. Don't worry about it. But in my mind, I took that role. But in my mind, I kept saying, but what happens when they figure out I don't know what I'm doing? And so that led me to reading books and blogs and listening to podcasts and then talking to other product people. I come to find out they're all asking, all of us are in some ways asking ourselves that question. But that's what led us to start Product Collective, to try to create this community where people could turn to. So it ended up turning into a positive, but I imagine that inner monologue, depending on, if it goes unchecked, it can lead to negatives too. I'm curious if you've seen, the opposite effect, and maybe there's a story that
Totally.
comes to mind.
Totally. I mean, so many stories. Like it happens in personal relationships all the time. But thinking about product teams specifically, I could think of two, and one I'll be more specific on. I think the one that happens a lot is just the decisions for what to put in your roadmap, right? On like what's important to our strategic plan, to our leadership. Do we have data to make this decision? Did we actually promise to make this thing? So we're building it because we think an exec or somebody else wants it. Like the number of times we've seen this rear its head related to AI conversations
Right.
of late, right? Of like, well, like, is this actually something we should build? Is it solving a problem? Is it solving a challenge for our customers? Is it going to yield a new benchmark or KPI? Well, but like our board asked for it, so I guess we have to build it, because if we don't, and then here's where the inner monologue comes in. If we don't, here's all the negative ramifications that may or may not actually be true because we haven't validated them. But our imagination's overactive. It's telling us stories about, well, based on what we choose to build or not choose to build, this is the potential outcome. But we don't always know. And I think on product teams, it's really important to be a quick decision maker, right? And to be decisive, not just to get everything perfect all the time. So your pattern matching is valuable there because it does help reduce some of the risks of, okay, like I've thought through this, right? I'm not just blindly shooting from the hip, but it can create a lot of challenges in what you choose to build. So I'll give an example from the social services sector. Our team does a lot of work in healthcare, as many folks do in the Midwest. And we were doing work with a social services provider to figure out why their audiences, their users, weren't continuing to use their service. And they had all of these assumptions as to, okay, like they're not continuing to come back to get service from us because of transportation or because of our hours and availability or because of childcare or because of all of these reasons that are really hard for this population to engage. And there are all these assumptions. Half of my team are researchers. So we went out and we actually talked to folks to figure out like what is driving your behavior? Why aren't you coming? Why aren't you continuing to access services? And I'll never forget this one story that a family told my researcher. This dad, he shared that, well, he wasn't going to keep coming because we track how often he's there. And she asked, well, why? Why is that problematic? Tell me more. And he said, well, I don't want you to take my kids away. And that was a really humbling moment to realize that this person had this innate fear of, hey, if I continue to engage in services, and I need these services for my family, you might see me as an inadequate parent. What if you call ODJFS? What if you have them come get my kids because I can't afford to feed them or house them or clothe them? And by the way, that's not true at all. And it wasn't based in something that came through as a part of that service journey, came through as a part of using the software involved. and there's nothing that showed up in the data that we had, right? The quantifiable data of this person's behavior. But by actually asking them and actually digging in further questions into why are you doing what you're doing, it allowed us to stop telling ourselves stories about why this person was choosing to show up or not, because the stories we had, the assumptions we were making, were not accurate. And I think we're constantly making those assumptions if we're not willing to ask why, both in what we choose to make, but especially within our own teams, right? Like, let's just imagine you're in a meeting with your boss and you're sharing a product update, sharing metrics of a recent launch, but your boss is kind of disengaged, or maybe they ask a pointed question that could imply some blame. And then, they're really not that into it. They cut the meeting short and they go into radio silence land. All the questions you ask them aren't responded to. What do you think? Why are you associating that behavior? Do you think you did something wrong? Are you mad? Are you ashamed? Like, instantly your inner monologue jumps to fill the gaps of, oh gosh, this must be why. What can I do about it? What's in my control? And the hard part is, like, sometimes you have it right and sometimes you're completely off base, but based on how your brain is trained and what it tells you, it will change what you choose to do about it next.
Yeah, it's everything you're saying. I feel that so much.
Yeah.
And I've experienced it before. I'm curious, in your personal experiences, like even dealing with that inner monologue, and you're right, it happens in products, but it happens in our personal
Everywhere.
lives constantly.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a parent too. I know I've had those inner monologues for sure. I'm curious if there are, I don't know if it's like techniques or things that you found helpful
Mm-hmm.
in trying to identify, okay, this is happening right now, and this
Yeah.
is harmful. I should
Yeah.
be putting a stop to this, or what do you do, I guess, in that situation? But maybe you
Yeah.
could talk more about that.
Totally. Yeah, I have a few different thoughts, and some of them are very introspective for you, and then some of them are things that you can do across your team. So, as far as what you could do for yourself, I've been a big practitioner of mindfulness, and there are a million resources out there that are better than what I can provide you to figure out how you start to capture the loops and become aware of like what your brain's telling you. Because I think the challenge is some people would say they don't have an inner monologue because they're not even really aware of what their like subconscious, their ego is telling them. So practicing mindfulness helps you catch the trigger a little bit more so that you're aware of how it's changing your feelings, your emotional state, your behavior. But something more practical and I think easier, more accessible is just doing a lot of journaling. So I would recommend free writing, brain writing, which is basically like an unfiltered conscious dump. And I feel like it's better if you manually write versus type. But the first thing in the morning, if you can get up and just start writing exactly what you're thinking of, like, oh, I'm tired. I don't really want to do this. I had a bad dream last night, yada, yada, yada. Just like basically transcribe, because your transcription is actually a reflection of your ego and what your brain is telling you. And what's really interesting is if you do this, you will see within, as soon as you clear the cobwebs a little bit of like the surface level stuff, your brain will start putting some stuff on paper you are not aware that your subconscious was saying to you, whether it's mean, whether it's fearful, it will find a way to surface it just as part of free writing. And then I do a lot of reflection after that, like, okay, what happened that made me think of that? How did I feel? And you'll start to recognize the patterns in your own thinking and become more aware of when you're having that response. Within your teams, I think the most helpful thing is to put on your researcher hat. And if you have researchers on your team, lucky you, spend more time with them and get used to asking why and why and why some more, right? Because I think when somebody shares something with you on your team, it's really easy to jump to a conclusion that you know what they meant by it. You understand their emotional state, you understand their incentives or why they're saying this thing, and you probably don't. And so if you just get to a place where you ask with a lot more curiosity, well, why did you say that? What would it look like? When is this true? When is it not true? You'll get better context and understanding so you're not making leaps that aren't accurate, which takes some muscle and takes some ritual to start to create, but helps you also better reflect on like, well, what can I control? What's in my power within the org and how I can get to what I want to learn and how I want to understand this thing. And I think the more that you could do that and model it on your team, the more it becomes a part of your culture. I'll share one other quick snippet. Our team is very close, tight knit. We have a strong retention culture, but that can create challenges where our team has a hard time like being super frank with each other because they're friends. They could be frank with our clients, but to say, hey, Mike, I don't know about that. It can be hard sometimes. So we read Radical Candor, did a book club. Those things are subliminally like kind of helpful. But we started doing weekly role playing where we would set up like these funny little experiments where we would say like, hey, here's the scenario. And Mike, you're the dad, and Lacey, you're the teenage daughter. And I want you, Mike, to give Lacey feedback, and I want you to model how you receive it. And we would do these funny little things every week, but it made the team much more comfortable with challenging each other. And then we would try and like, applaud and uplift when they would challenge one another publicly. And it created like a very, very big impact in our culture pretty quickly. But it takes a ritual, not a one-off, in order to cement a new behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. What's really helpful. I appreciate that. And by the way, as a quick aside to everybody, if you have questions for Lacey, we have another 10 minutes here. So I definitely want to get to as many of your questions as possible. Feel free to load them up in the Q&A section. One of the things I'm curious about, Lacey, is that I think, doing what we're talking about now, just talking about it is helpful. What you just recommended before, even journaling, starting to write things down, that can be really helpful in order for us to sort of recognize this inner dialogue, this inner voice. What I'm trying to think of is the ideal outcome, right? Like it's not to make that inner voice go away, never goes away really. But when we think about the ideal situation, what does it look like? Like, what does it mean? What are we shooting for here?
Absolutely. And I think it's really important what you just said, Mike, and that your goal isn't to make it go away. It's like numbing yourself to your feelings. Anyone who's ever been in therapy knows that's not actually a good strategy. So you need to be aware of what you're telling yourself. Like, what are the stories that are frequently running in your head? But I think the power of starting to master your inner monologue, to catch it, to be aware of like your emotional state and how your inner monologue is affecting it. It helps you no longer jump to assumptions and hold things as facts, right? Because it will make you more curious and make you desire questioning, both introspectively, like, oh, why did I think that? Why do I feel this way? What's going on inside of my brain and heart right now? It'll make you much more curious to realize, oh, maybe I should ask Mike, is that really what he meant? What's actually the priority? Or even to do some reflection, right? To say, okay, Mike, like, I heard you said this is important to you. Let me reflect what I heard and make sure I have it captured right. Or another strategy that I reflect, like if somebody says something to me that doesn't hit right and is making me tell myself a story, I will reflect back, hey, you just said this, and like this might not be accurate, but I got to tell you, the story I'm telling myself is this is actually what you believe. Is that true, or do I have it wrong? And I think by just putting it out there, it can be really disarming to the other person. It builds a ton of trust and transparency. And you could put your fears to rest, because the worst thing that they could tell you is, oh, you're right. That's actually true. And how do we go from here? But at least then But I think 9 times out of 10, like you're so much more fear-based than what is reality. And it gives them the opportunity to say, oh no, Lacey, that's not what I meant. I'm so sorry. Let me clarify. This is actually my interpretation. This is actually the conclusion I'm getting to.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it sounds like if we do these things, like I could foresee several positive outcomes, right? It's like, well, we're collaborating better. There's better communication. We don't have to let things fester as much. Are there other sort of outcomes that you see happening when we put some of these things into practice?
Yeah, something besides like team connectedness and psychological safety within your product org, I think one of the biggest things that comes to mind is just alignment, which I know sounds like, okay, that's silly. That's of course like important. But I've been running roundtables the last few years with product leaders and talking about what keeps us up at night. And I tell you, what's funny is the majority of the conversations have little to do with product and a lot to do with people and communication. And alignment is almost always like an underlying challenge between different peoples across an org, whether they're in a leadership role and an IC role. Like, are we actually saying the same thing? Are we talking about these things as important? If I get to this outcome, like, what do you expect will happen? What does success look like? Like all of these great alignment questions, but it tends to be a misalignment as to why so much friction happens between folks in orgs, especially a sizable org, but even in ours, and we're not a mega sized company, right? Is like, are we actually aligned? Are we thinking and saying and feeling the same thing? And so I think that is one of the most powerful benefits of being aware of your mental chatter and of what your narrative is it allows you to align with others and helps them become more aware of theirs too, right? So they're not telling themselves a story that may or may not be accurate.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of myself in the shoes of a product manager, and we're all, we feel these things, but we also need to accomplish a lot in our day to day. And some of these things we're talking about, these are all great things for sure.
Yeah.
Sometimes though, the decisions we make, they have to be quick decisions. How do we
Mm-hmm.
balance making sure that inner dialogue that we're having,
Yeah.
that we can quiet it, we can make sure it's in a
Yeah.
positive place, but also with the fact that we do have to make quick decisions on the
Yes.
fly. Like I imagine these things we're talking about, they don't need to, it just doesn't mean it needs to slow us down, right?
No, no, not at all. If anything, I think it can actually speed you up a lot because your mental chatter can affect you in a millisecond, right? Of just like how you interpret something. You actually feel it in your body sometimes before the words go through your head. It'll make you like tighten up or clench or like go from having super happy, elated mood to, oh, it's one of those kind of meetings, right? Like it just like instantly will change your mood. And then we'll create ruminations throughout the day. Like, I don't know about you or anybody else on the call, but like the amount of ruminations I get into if I'm taking a shower because there's no other stimulus, there's not like a kid poking at you or an email coming through, like the amount of things that I'm like almost in an argument with myself about internally, like you could ruminate and then just lose time or make decisions that are counter to what should be done because you're so in your head. And by the way, this plagues all people. Like this is not just like it's not a product person problem or a leader problem. It's just very human nature to have this inner voice. But if you start to learn how to handle it, be aware of it, understand where it's taking you, it will help you make faster, more confident decisions because you're not so worried about something that may or may not happen, right? Like I think mental chatter actually creates a lot of current day, in the moment suffering for something that might never happen in the future. And so it helps mitigate a lot of that.
Yeah. Well, I imagine there's people that are here with us at this session and are liking what they're hearing, right? They're seeing the value in it, but we might cut off and then they might think to themselves, okay, where do I start? If I want to get better at this over time, like what steps should I start to take now? And you started to mention some earlier that I think would be great, like next steps for folks. How would you outline what maybe next steps could be for people that do want to get better at all this?
Such a great question. I think journaling is honestly the easiest and it takes a new habit to create, right? But 5 minutes of journaling or less a day, and even doing it for 2 weeks will make a huge difference in your awareness of your habits, or just like commit to doing it after a really important meeting. Like if you have an all hands this week or a big presentation, commit to journaling right before and right after what you're thinking. Just free write. I don't mean just journal and like don't edit what you're saying, don't bullet point it. It should literally be a stream of consciousness of whatever you're thinking. And that can really unlock a lot of awareness into what is bothering you or what is driving your decision making. The other thing I think is really helpful from a journaling perspective, Mike, is let's say that there's like a current challenge that you have at work. Let's say you have some friction with a teammate. Let's say somebody in sales is driving you crazy. Like that happens for a lot of us in product. I will sometimes like keep a evidence journal, where I write down like, what is my assumption? Like, oh, like Tony really doesn't want to work with the product team. He just wants to force us to do what he wants. And then I will make 2 columns and I will intentionally document. I'll leave some evidence as to how that's true, but I'll try to prioritize evidence for when that isn't true. Because sometimes it's not. And I'm just so sensitive and keyed into all the evidence that Tony actually doesn't respect the product team. Tony just wants, and by the way, I'm sorry if there's a Tony on the call and you're in sales, but like if he just doesn't really respect us, he doesn't care what we think, he's just going to ask us to build, he doesn't get it. Okay, you're going to keep seeing that evidence because you're attuned to it. But if you can intentionally try and journal and write down evidence to the contrary, evidence to like, oh no, he actually asked for our opinion. Oh no, he involved us in a meeting he didn't used to involve us in. That can be super helpful because as soon as you like start that narrative in your head that you're sensitive to, always or never, like it's going to start to change how you behave, how you show up, and it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I actually think it's incredibly powerful to do something as simple as journaling. And then just like talk more about it, right? Like talk with your teammates, say like, hey, I'm going to ask you more questions than I normally do. But it's not about slowing things down. It's truly like changing a ritual and changing some of your habits inside of things you're already doing. And once that becomes a habit, it's super easy to maintain.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I know one of the things you mentioned earlier were communication games that you had
Oh
played
yeah.
with your team, and somebody had asked about that, where you found information about that. Maybe you could,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if you have recommendations or guidance there.
Oh goodness, I see that from Nancy. We made them up, Nancy. So we did a book club, books that I've read that I thought were somewhat helpful. But it's kind of like the challenge of, like you go to a great conference. My team and I will be at Industry, so maybe I'll see you in Cleveland. Well, I'll definitely see Mike. But then you get back and you're like, great. How do I integrate all these great things? How do I like make this a part of my day to day? I'm inspired, but now like I'm buried under other stuff. And so I realized, like, gosh, we have to find a way to practice this. And it might be too sensitive to practice it within the guise of work and real problems, real challenges we're working through. So let's make it silly. Let's take the pressure off of it. We have a teammate who's super big in improv. She sometimes hosts her improv troupe here at Zoco. And so it's like, okay, like help us come up with some silly scripts. And it's just all about giving and receiving feedback and being more candid with things we're thinking and feeling. And it led to this thing that the team owned. I didn't, where they like started to create all these like custom icons in Slack where they would like tag each other and say like be more candid and share more. And so it created a ritual that they were excited about because it was something that we were just embedding in our process. But I think the more that you can make it like low stress, make it silly, make it tangible, but down to that core thing you're working on, the better it is. Easier for people to adopt.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Lacey, I know we're already at the end of our session. Time flew by quickly, which usually that's a really good thing. But this is great. I'm going to share the recording with everybody. If there's people here that wants to keep tabs on you and your work, maybe they end up with questions and they want to reach out. What's the best way to keep tabs of you, your work, Zoco, how to get in touch with you, all that?
You've got it. Yeah, I think probably the easiest thing is to find me on LinkedIn. You can add me, you can send me a note. I will see you at Industry. If a few of you want to get together and have a drink over there, I would be super happy to because we'll be driving up from Columbus. I think that's easiest. And of course, you can look into our work at Zoco and all that we're up to. But I love connecting on hairy human problems. That's really how I've built my career. So anyone who wants to talk more on this, I am game.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Lacey, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. This is awesome to catch up with you. And yeah, I'll definitely see you at Industry too.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.